Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSP Magazine. You're listening to a new episode of Stories from Space podcast, where your host, Matthew Williams, examines the history of human spaceflight, the breakthroughs that revolutionized our understanding of the universe and our place in it, and the brave individuals who work tirelessly to advance the frontiers of our understanding. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
The authors acknowledge that this podcast was recorded on the traditional, unceded lands of the Lekwungen peoples. Hello, and welcome back to Stories from Space. I'm your host, Matt Williams, and today we will be starting a new segment where we look at other space programs from around the world and how they got to where they are today. And where better to start than with the Chinese space program? In recent years, they've become not only a rising star in the field of space exploration, but a major contender that is now directly challenging NASA for its position as the leader in space, something that they've enjoyed for many decades, going all the way back to the space race. And in addition to exploring how they got to where they are today, how they've experienced some very impressive growth, and achieved several major milestones, taken several impressive strides. We're also going to look at their inception and how this really demonstrates that all major space agencies today, they have very similar origin stories. And of course, we'll be looking at the future, how China plans to send crewed missions to the moon, create a permanent lunar habitat there, and send crewed missions to Mars, all of which are directly challenging NASA's plans, the Moon to Mars mission architecture, as well as their plans to create the successor space station to the ISS, which will no longer be operational after 2030. And so to look at the history of China's space program, as I said, you'll notice a lot of similarities between the Russian or Soviet space program and that of the United States, as well as others that we'll look at in the course of this series. Basically, the space program began as a part of the Cold War. It was tied to the development of nuclear weapons and rocketry and avionics, all of which had emerged in the Second World War, and now all the major powers of the world were vying for supremacy in that respect. And China had a vested interest in the development of rocketry and nuclear weapons because, as a revolutionary regime that had taken power only in 1948, they were concerned about being left behind and being vulnerable. They certainly wanted a nuclear deterrent of their own, especially since in 1953, as a means of bringing the Korean War to an end, the United States threatened China with a nuclear attack. And this was due to all the logistical and manpower support that they were sending to the North Korean regime, as well as their ongoing fight with the Republic of China, at this point headquartered in Taiwan. And so, like their American Soviet counterparts, China embarked on a nuclear program by 1955 at the behest of Chairman Mao, who announced the decision during the Central Committee meeting of the Communist Party of China. And in 1957, when the Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite into space, Sputnik 1, Mao declared that China needed its own space program as well. And the first step in this was the launch of an artificial satellite of their own by 1959 during the 10th anniversary of the Communist Revolution of China. And again, like his Soviet and American counterparts, this was out of a desire to not be left behind or to be kept at a strategic disadvantage, but also to garner respect, not just from the U.S. and its NATO allies, but from the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact and other nations that were caught up in the Cold War and seeking to demonstrate whose system of governance and whose economic model worked. And as of October 8, 1956, China's first rocket missile development agency was established, known as the Fifth Research Institute. which was established by China's Ministry of National Defense. And this essentially meant that it was now a matter of national defense to develop a space program, start sending satellites into orbit, and eventually a crewed space program. So henceforth, all developments in space technology would mirror the growth in nuclear weapons technology. And what followed between the late 1950s and the turn of the century was a process of gradual buildup for the Chinese space program, which would ultimately set the stage for China becoming an official major power in space by the 21st century. And the first set of milestones that they achieved happened in 1958. First, in April, when China broke ground on its first launch site near Jiuquan in Inner Mongolia. And this was known at the time as the Jiuquan Satellite Launch Center, or Launch Complex B2. The site would later expand to become the Dongfeng Aerospace City. And it was here that China experimented with their Dongfeng 1 launch vehicle, which was basically a Chinese version of the Soviet R2 rocket, which itself was the Soviet version of the German V2 rocket. These were being brought back from Germany and reverse engineered and rebuilt in the Soviet Union. And thanks to a technology transfer program between the two communist states in the 1950s, this allowed the Chinese scientists to have access to Soviet designs and recreate them. And when you see pictures of the Dongfeng 1 and the R2 rocket, you can see there's similarities not only with each other, but with the German V2. So they all basically look like the representations we see whenever there's kitschy sci-fi or retro sci-fi, that type of appearance, right? The tail fins, the profile that looks like a cross between a cigar and a dart. It's difficult to explain, but you'll know when you see it. Unfortunately, this transfer program and relations between China and the Soviet Union, they wouldn't last. After Stalin died in 1953, and Khrushchev officially replaced him as leader of the Soviet Union by 1958, the two countries began embarking on rather different paths. Khrushchev was very afraid of sharing nuclear technology with Chairman Mao, largely because of very, very inflammatory statements he made about how China could survive a nuclear war. And by 1960, this resulted in the Sino-Soviet split, at which point China pursued its nuclear weapons program and space technologies independently. So while this was a setback for both of these programs in China, they did manage to succeed in developing intercontinental ballistic missiles and nuclear warheads by the 1960s. And these would have applications for space exploration in very short order. So, for example, by February 19, 1960, China successfully launched their first sounding rocket, and this was known as the T-7, which was the Chinese version of the Soviet R-7. And the R-7 would go on to become the workhorse of the Soviet space program and Russian space program, eventually giving rise to the Soyuz rocket. Later that year, they conducted the first successful launch of their Dongfeng 1 launch vehicle, which at this point was being used as a medium-range ballistic missile, and by 1964, they launched its successor, the DF-2. But more significantly, by July 19, 1964, China conducted the first launch of living creatures from their soil to space using the redesigned T-7 rocket. And these creatures consisted of 8 white mice, were sent to orbit and later recovered from the Guangdi rocket launch site. And by 1967, in response to NASA's Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs and the Soviets' Vostok, Voskhod, and Soyuz programs, Mao ordered that all necessary steps should be taken to put an astronaut into space, or as they referred to in China, taikonauts. So over the next 3 years, China worked diligently to develop their first heavy launch vehicles. And this included the 2-stage Fenbao 1, which was unveiled in 1969, and the 3-stage Changzhen 1, or Long March 1, in 1970. And these rockets allowed for the first satellites to be launched from China, which took place in 1970 and 71. The first was a communications satellite, while the second carried a magnometer and a cosmic ray X-ray detector to space. And by 1971, China officially adopted their first crewed space program, known as Project 714, which called for the use of the new Shiguang designed space capsule, which was inspired largely by the American Gemini capsule. And like the Gemini capsule, was meant to accommodate 2 crew members, with a proposed launch date of 1973. And by March of that same year, the first 19 taikonauts were chosen. So in this respect, China was hoping to conduct their own version of Mercury and Gemini into one project, or, in the Russians' case, Vostok and Voskhod. Unfortunately, the program was cancelled in the midst of the Cultural Revolution, which began 5 years earlier and lasted for another 5 years, so from 1966 to 1976. And the chaos and turmoil that resulted from this Cultural Revolution caused severe disruption to multiple Chinese industries. And with the death of Mao in 1976, several projects were canceled and progress towards a crewed mission slowed considerably. Nevertheless, a few key accomplishments were still made. On November 26, 1975, China successfully launched their first recoverable satellite, the Fanwei Shi Weixin satellite, which was successfully launched and returned to Earth after 3 days. And as with other recoverable satellites in this series, the purpose of this mission was to test systems designed for crewed missions. And 1979 also saw the deployment of China's first tracking ship, known as Wanwang, or Longview. And as with their Soviet NASA counterparts, the purpose of these ships is to track the telemetry of various medium and long-range missiles, satellites, and spacecraft, and determine their landing points, so where the crew can be recovered, and their space capsule, if necessary, retrieved. During the 1980s, China made further progress with full-range ICBMs, which also led to the development of the Long March 2 and 3 rockets. And this further allowed China to adopt a commercial launch program by 1985, and the ability to launch satellites for various countries and interests, primarily European and Asian ones. And by 1986, with the Cultural Revolution now 10 years in their rearview mirror, China's Communist Party once again decided to set some ambitious long-term goals. And this included the development of a crewed spacecraft and space station, which of course were inspired largely by the Soviet Salyut program and NASA's Skylab. Furthermore, China also wanted to develop a spaceplane similar to the Space Shuttle and the Buran Shuttle, and this was known as Project 836-204, which they hoped would lead to a spaceplane that could ferry astronaut crews to a Chinese space station. However, after exploring concepts similar to what NASA and the Soviet space program had created, the program leaders opted instead for a simpler space capsule design. And while these plans didn't materialize in the time frame originally hoped for, it did lay the groundwork for what would be China's first crewed missions to space, which would have to wait until shortly after the turn of the century. And speaking of said groundwork, it was also during this period that China developed its current space monitoring and control network, which consisted of the Beijing Aerospace Flight Control Center, the Xi'an Satellite Measurement and Control Center, and 4 Wanwang-class space survey ships, as well as multiple land-based monitoring and control stations. In 1989 and 1991, 2 major events would take place that would forever alter the future of China, its political system, and its space program. And these were the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, followed shortly thereafter the collapse of the Soviet Union. In response to these events, China began enacting reforms to ensure the long-term survival of the Chinese Communist Party and the system that they had built up in the wake of Chairman Mao's death. In terms of their space program, one very notable change was the nomenclature. Whereas in the past, Chinese space program used names that reflected revolutionary history, they turned to using mystical religious names from Chinese mythology and ancient history. There were, however, exceptions, such as the Long March family of rockets, which were already in use at the time, and would continue to be named Changzhen. Also, in 1993, China's space program was reformed with the creation of the China National Space Administration and the China Science and Industry Aerospace Corporation. Whereas the former was responsible for planning and developing space activities, the latter was now in charge of developing space-related technologies. And in 1999, the China National Space Administration, or CNSA, conducted the first launch of the Shenzhou spacecraft. This was a modified version of the Russian Soyuz spacecraft, which represented a new era of support and repaired relations between the countries. Much like the Soyuz spacecraft, the Shenzhou was designed to support China's crewed space missions, and in 2003 they made their first attempt. This was the Shenzhou 5 mission, which launched a single taikonaut, Commander Yang Liwei, to orbit on October 13, 2003 for 21 hours. This mission was essentially China's Mercury program and Vostok program combined, and it managed to achieve similar results. At 21 hours spent in space, Commander Yang's flight was comparable to the Vostok 2 flight with cosmonaut German Titov, and the Mercury program's Faith 7 launch, which was piloted by Leroy Gordon Cooper, Jr. Also in 2003, the CNSA inaugurated the Chinese Lunar Exploration Program, or Chang'e, named after the Chinese moon goddess. This program envisioned robotic missions to the moon as precursors for an eventual crewed mission. Integral to the realization of this program were the heavy launch vehicles, the Long March 3B and 3C. Between the two of them, these rockets sent the first three missions of the Chang'e program to the moon. This included the Chang'e 1 mission, which launched in 2007, and consisted of a lunar orbiter that gathered data on its surface in order to scout landing sites for future missions. This was followed by the Chang'e 2 mission in 2010, which also gathered data on the surface of the moon, and then flew to the Earth-Sun L2 Lagrange point, where it tested China's Telemetry, Tracking, and Command, or TTC, network. This completed Phase 1 of the Chang'e program and led to Phase 2, where China would begin sending both a lander and a rover to explore the surface, the first of which was the Chang'e 3 lander, which deployed U2, or Jade Rabbit in Chinese, which explored the northern region of Mare Imbrium, where it gathered topographical data and conducted a geological survey. The Chang'e 3 mission was also distinguished for accomplishing the first soft landing on the moon since 1976. U2 is also the first rover to operate on the lunar surface since the Soviet Lunokhod 2 ceased operations in 1973. And in 2018, the Chang'e 4 lander was sent to the far side of the moon, where it would deploy the U2-2 rover to explore the South Pole Aitken Basin. The purpose of this mission was to scout possible landing sites for future crewed missions and assess the local resources and terrain for the construction of a future lunar base. The lander also carried the Lunar Micro-Ecosystems Experiment. This consisted of metal cylinders filled with seeds and insect eggs designed to test how lunar gravity would affect living creatures. The experiment met with some early success when some of the cotton seeds sprouted inside the cylinder. Unfortunately, the rover was caught in lunar night, and without an adequate heating system, the plants froze. The orbiter element of this mission also tested the ability to relay communications from the far side of the moon, which are essential to future operations, since direct communications aren't possible with this side of the moon. This concluded Phase 2 of the program, which would be followed by sample return missions, consisting of the Chang'e 5 T1. This mission was launched on October 23, 2014, and was designed to test a lunar return spacecraft and its ability to return samples to Earth. This paved the way for the Chang'e 5 sample return mission, which launched on November 23, 2020. The mission reached the lunar surface on December 1st and returned to Earth with 1,731 grams, or 61.1 ounces, of lunar regolith for study. This effectively gave way to Phase 4, which consisted of the Chang'e 6 mission, launching on May 3, 2024, to study the topography, composition, and subsurface structure of the South Pole Aitken Basin. Like its predecessor, Chang'e 6 also returned samples to Earth and carried a Chinese rover named Jinshan, or Chinese for golden toad. This mini-rover conducted infrared spectroscopy of the lunar surface and imaged the Chang'e 6 lander on the lunar surface. The two remaining missions, Chang'e 7 and Chang'e 8, are scheduled to launch in 2026 and 2028. Chang'e 7 will consist of an orbiter, a lander, and a mini flying probe that will explore the South Pole Aitken Basin for potential resources. Meanwhile, Chang'e 8 will verify in situ resource development and utilization technologies. It will include a lander, a rover, and a flying detector, as well as a 3D printing experiment. The purpose of this last experiment is to test in situ resource utilization, where local resources such as water ice and lunar regolith will be used to test build a structure. Like Chang'e 4, it will also transport a small sealed ecosystem experiment. This will test out key technologies necessary for the construction of a lunar science base, which will be tasked with growing plants for the astronauts and crew. Between 2011 and today, China has also achieved a major milestone in space in the form of its Tiangong program. Tiangong, meaning Celestial Palace in Chinese, refers to the series of space stations that were designed to test the technology and components for construction of a large modular space station. In 2011, the Tiangong 1 station was launched, where it supported crewed missions until it was decommissioned in 2018. In 2016, the station's successor, Tiangong 2, was launched into orbit. Building on the successes of the first, this station was designed to test systems and processes for mid-term space stays and refueling. As such, it accommodated multiple crews over longer periods of time. In July 2019, Tiangong 2 was also decommissioned, was deorbited and burned up in Earth's atmosphere. The knowledge and experience obtained from these two previous stations went into the creation of the Tiangong 3, or Tiangong Modular Station, construction of which began in 2021. This consisted of the launch of the Tianhe, or cabin module. Tianhe literally translates to Harmony of the Heavens. In July of 2022, it was joined by the Wentian, or Quest for the Heavens, laboratory cabin module. Third and final launch consisted of the Mengtian, or Dreaming of the Heavens, laboratory cabin module, which launched in October of 2022. The station has since hosted many rotating astronaut crews, and there are plans for expansion. Beyond the success of these two programs, China has also achieved multiple strides in terms of rocket development. In 2016, the Long March 5 rocket launched for the first time. This two-stage heavy launch vehicle was vital to the construction of the Tiangong space station and for the future of China's crewed space program. In 2017, Chinese officials also announced their plan for the development of a reusable space plane similar to the U.S. Air Force's X-37B. And on September 4th, 2020, the resulting space plane, which is still shrouded in secrecy, launched on a Long March 2F rocket and returned to Earth after spending just 2 days in orbit. On August 4th, 2022, the reusable space plane was launched for a second time. While in orbit, it deployed at least one object that may have been a small satellite or monitoring craft and returned to Earth on May 8, 2023, after spending 276 days in orbit. The third and final mission took off on December 14, 2023, which released at least 7 objects into orbit and returned to Earth on September 6, 2024, after spending 266 days and 10 hours in orbit. And in April of 2020, China announced that the first independent mission sent by their country to Mars would be named Tianwen-1, or Quest for Heavenly Truth. By July of that same year, Tianwen-1 launched, consisting of an orbiter, a lander, and a rover element. The lander and rover elements landed on the surface of Mars on May of 2021, making China the third nation to make a soft landing on Mars, after the US and the Soviet space program. The deployment of the Zhurong rover also made China the second nation after the US to ever deploy a rover on the Martian surface. Looking to the future, the Chinese space program has some very bold ideas. These include creating a permanent base around the lunar South Pole, sending crewed missions to Mars that will culminate in the creation of another permanent base there, and creating a successor station to the ISS in low Earth orbit, along with several robotic missions that will push the frontiers of science and our exploration of the outer solar system, near-Earth objects, and comets. On March 9, 2021, China and Russia formally signed a Memorandum of Understanding that established a cooperative agreement between their two countries and their respective space programs to build an International Lunar Research Station, or ILRS. The plans, which were subsequently released, indicated that construction on this base would begin after the Chang'e 8 mission and would be completed by 2035. This station is meant to rival NASA's own plans for an Artemis base camp, which would include the Lunar Gateway as well as several surface elements. Similar to the Artemis Accords, China and Russia have also indicated that they are seeking international partnerships in order to realize this base, and for other space agencies to realize the benefits of its research and exploration potential. To date, 13 countries have signed on to the program, including China and Russia, as well as Azerbaijan, Belarus, Egypt, Nicaragua, Serbia, Pakistan, South Africa, Thailand, Venezuela, Kazakhstan, and Senegal. That same year, the Chinese government announced that it planned to send crewed missions to Mars along the same timetable that NASA had originally proposed, beginning in 2033, with follow-up missions every 26 months, ultimately leading to the creation of a Martian surface habitat. In order to make both these plans happen, China has been developing the Long March 9 and 10, both of which are three-stage Super Heavy launch vehicles similar to the Saturn V of the Apollo program. And while some progress has been made with both launch vehicles, it is doubtful that the Long March 9, which is clearly intended for sending missions on a trans-Martian injection, will be ready in time by 2033. And in low Earth orbit, China intends to use the lessons learned from the Tiangong program to create a successor space station that will replace the ISS once it's retired in 2030. From all these plans, it is clear that China intends to cement its reputation as a major space power and as a rival for NASA. Whether or not they will succeed in this endeavor remains to be seen. Nevertheless, one thing is clear. From its relatively humble beginnings in the Cold War era to the major reforms instituted near the turn of the century and its many impressive accomplishments since, the Chinese space program has established itself as one of the top 5 space agencies in the world. With the decline of Roscosmos, which began in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, China is poised to become the number 2 power in space between NASA and the European Space Agency. India's space program has been making many impressive strides in recent years, and may find itself challenging China for the number 2 spot in the not-too-distant future. Regardless, if and when permanent bases are established on the Moon and Mars, it is likely that each of them will be flying many different flags. The days where space was largely dominated by 2 major powers has run its course. If there is to be a brave new future for humanity in space, it will be characterized more and more by accessibility, representation, and international cooperation. Even though China and its partners are in direct competition with NASA and its partners, one thing all sides agree on is the spirit of the Outer Space Treaty, that space is for all and for the benefit of all humanity. Tune in next time where we will be taking a look at India's rising space program the legacy and contribution of Islamic, Persian, and Indian astronomers, and where we will take a look at the past, present, and future of space stations. In the meantime, thank you for listening. I'm Matt Williams, and this has been Stories from Space.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Stories from Space podcast with Matthew Williams. If you learned something new and this podcast made you think, then share itspmagazine.com with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.